He came all this way for a chance to live, and now the only thing standing between Michael of Chernigov and survival is a single bow. The heat hits first, not the idol, not the guards positioned at the edges of the firelight. The heat pressing through the tent like a hand laid flat over your mouth, and the smell of meat on a blade that has already been used tonight. The braziers spit and crackle. The tent is full of stillness, but it is not peaceful stillness. The outcome has already been settled by a man who has not yet bothered to look up. Batu Khan sits elevated in the dimness, framed by smoke, tearing a strip of roasted meat free from the bone with his fingers and feeding it to the hound that rests at his side. This is not a crisis to Batu. It is a delay before dinner. The guards shift in the shadows. The hound chews, and the interpreter steps forward to tell the prince exactly what it will cost to walk out of this tent alive. You know what it feels like when compromise starts small enough to look like wisdom. You tell yourself it is temporary. You tell yourself it is strategic, that you are not surrendering your principles, only managing the cost of keeping them until conditions improve. You keep your mouth shut at the wrong moment, nod at the thing you know is wrong, and file the discomfort away under the same heading everyone uses for things they intend to address later. It is a uniquely human trick, the ability to experience moral erosion as pragmatism. And it works, right up until the moment the concession being demanded is no longer small, and the person demanding it is no longer pretending to negotiate. That is the trap Michael walks into. But here is what the textbook version never tells you. He walked in with his eyes open. He was not naive. He was not reckless. He had survived the Mongol conquest by understanding precisely how the machine worked, and he had watched other men make the opposite choice and die for it without changing a single thing. He knew the mathematics of submission. He had filed that lesson carefully and used it before. So the question is not whether Michael is in danger. He is. The question is simpler and far worse. What kind of man walks willingly into the most powerful war machine on Earth, prepared to submit on its terms, and still ends up choosing death over one last bow? That is the mystery box, not the execution. The line. In the polished summary, Michael of Chernigov is reduced to a sentence. He refused to bow to the Mongols, so they killed him. But that version collapses the pressure that makes the choice unbearable. It removes the weeks of travel, the weight of the road, the memory of burned cities, the very plausible and documented possibility that compliance was survivable, and replaces all of it with a foregone conclusion that costs the reader nothing to read and teaches them nothing about the man inside it. By the time Batu summons him to Sarai in 1246, the Mongol conquest of Rusas is not a recent wound. It is a settled fact. Ryazan burned in 1237. Vladimir fell that same winter. Kiev, the ancient heart of Rusas, was sacked so thoroughly that travelers reported human bones carpeting the roads around it. Batu rules the Golden Horde not by occupying every fortress, but by turning princes into tributaries, issuing yarliks, collecting tribute, and leaving just enough local structure standing that the system can continue feeding itself indefinitely. The genius of the Horde is not that it destroys everything, it is that it leaves just enough to extract from. Michael is not stepping into a battle, he is stepping into an inspection. The system does not care whether he is brave or broken, it only cares whether he can be made to kneel. Michael did not arrive at Sarai by accident. He arrived after years of watching the world he had known dismantle itself piece by piece under Mongol pressure, and after learning in the hardest possible ways what it means to survive beneath a power that no longer uses the language of equals. He had already fled once, seeking refuge in Hungary when the pressure on Chernigov became impossible to manage from within, because there are moments in history when exile is not cowardice, but arithmetic, when survival is the only resistance that preserves anything worth defending. He had seen what happened to the men who resisted too early. He had filed that lesson and moved on. So when the envoy arrived in the cold hall at Chernigov, and the summons was translated slowly enough for dread to arrive before comprehension, Michael had the full measure of what he was being asked to do. Come to Sarai, submit to the ritual, receive your Yarlik, pay tribute, govern your lands inside the Horde's framework, and call yourself a prince while doing it. The offer was not an insult, it was a transaction. And transactions, even humiliating ones, are survivable. Other princes had done exactly this. Yaroslav of Vladimir was confirmed in his position by Batu Khan. He submitted and came home with his title and Mongol support intact. The pattern was clear, documented, and available to any man with the political intelligence to read it. Submission was not the end of a prince's story. In most cases, it was simply the beginning of a more expensive chapter. Michael has spent his entire political life learning how to absorb cost without breaking. He has bent when bending was the only option, retreated when retreat preserved what mattered, and swallowed the kind of humiliation that princes file under realism rather than shame. He has woken up the morning after each of those compromises still holding Chernigov. So why not once more? Because this time, the line is no longer political. He does not yet know the exact shape of the demand waiting inside the ritual logic of Sarai. He only knows it is there, something different, something that does not resolve itself the way tribute resolves, the way a Yarlik resolves. He carries with him the quiet, structural weight of a faith that has defined every decision he has ever made, not loudly or performatively, but the way a foundation defines a building without ever being visible to the people living inside it. And that is what made the journey dangerous. Not the road itself, not the miles. The temptation, the belief that what awaited him in Sarai was still only a political price, one more humiliation a prince could endure and survive. If he bends, he goes home, sees his people again, and governs them under peace instead of raids. That was the offer he believed it to be. That was exactly why it worked. What would you do in this exact moment? I read every single comment, so drop your thoughts below. I want to know where you think your own line is, and if you have stayed this far, you are not here by accident. You care what history actually did to the people trapped inside it, not just what the textbook says happened afterward. That makes you one of the remnants, the viewers who want the buried chapters, not the safe summary. By being here, you are helping pull these forgotten voices out of the dark. Subscribe so the algorithm knows these stories still matter. Back to Sarai. Sarai does not look like a capital. It does not announce itself with stone walls or towers or the accumulated visual grammar of a city built to impress. It looks instead like a breathing mechanism, a living, purposeful organism of felt tents, wooden structures, horse lines stretching into the distance, and soldiers, servants, and ledgermen moving in patterns that feel less like urban life and more like digestion. Like something very large consuming something else very slowly and very completely. Michael is escorted deeper in, past the outer edges where traders and functionaries work, past the administrative middle ring where the empire processes its paperwork, and into the interior where the ritual logic of the Horde operates by a different set of rules entirely. His gifts have already been counted. His name has already been written down. The value of his presence has already been reduced to what it can produce for the treasury. Then the ritual begins. 2 braziers stand at the threshold, burning bright and close enough together that the air between them shimmers in sheets. The ceremony is precise. To pass between the fires is to acknowledge the Horde's power to cleanse and remake, to begin the process of remapping a man's allegiances in the image of Mongol authority. The interpreter steps forward. The guards do not blink, walk between the fires, bow before the image, bow towards the south, bow before Batu, and Batu himself remains elevated in the smoke, feeding strips of meat from his fingers to the hound at his feet with the unhurried ease of a man conducting a minor administrative formality. He does not perform his power. He has no need to perform it. The tent performs it for him. The scale of the camp outside, The guards in every corner, the sheer mechanical weight of the system that brought Michael to this room. Batu is simply the point at which all of that weight converges, and he wears it the way men who have never doubted their authority wear it, lightly, casually, with their attention mostly elsewhere. Now the shape of the thing Michael has been riding toward finally resolves itself with complete clarity. This is not a tribute ceremony. This is not a political submission dressed in Mongol protocol. The fires, the image, the direction of the bow. These are acts of worship, not obedience, reverence, a political submission Michael can survive. This he cannot. His jaw tightens. His hands stay still at his sides. His body holds itself in the rigid stillness of a man whose mind has already made the decision and is now simply waiting for the rest of him to finish arriving at it. The silence stretches across the tent like something physical. Then it becomes an answer. He will not walk through the fire. He will not bow to the image. He will not worship. The refusal changes the room immediately, and the machine that surrounds Michael begins to move. The sources agree here in their broad shape. What follows is not impulsive. It has the quality of procedure, of a system executing a previously established response to a category of event it has encountered before. Michael is beaten savagely, the blows delivered not in the heat of anger, but with the systematic thoroughness of men carrying out an instruction. The chronicles describe the violence as prolonged, the process not concluded quickly, as if the camp has the patience of an institution and intends to use it. And then Michael of Chernigov is killed. Theodore stands beside the body of his prince, the man he rode every mile of this road alongside, the man whose refusal he witnessed and understood in full. The system turns to him now with a different kind of offer. Theodore is not a prince. He is not required here the way Michael was. There is room, if he wants it, to step back from the dead man's decision. Submit, and be not only spared, but honored. The counselor who abandons a lost cause is not disgraced. He is practical. Every reasonable calculation says yield. Theodore refuses. The sources blur at the edge of what follows, but their destination is the same. Some accounts say Theodore is struck down by the guards. Others describe a knife. All of them agree on the shape of the act. The man who traveled this road to its end is killed for it, without ceremony, without negotiation, without the system pausing to register the weight of what it has just done. Theodore falls. The floor of the tent drinks his blood, and Batu, above the smoke, continues to feed the hound. Outside the tent, Sarai does not pause. Horses are watered at the lines. Traders argue over weights and silver in the outer camp. Riders thunder out on the relay roads carrying messages that will arrive before the news of 2 dead men. The ledgermen continue their counting. The sources note that the bodies were left outside the camp, abandoned to the dogs, until Christians recovered them in secret and buried them. Later tradition says their firmness had consequences beyond that tent, that the refusal of these 2 men impressed itself so deeply on those who witnessed and recorded it, that the Horde eventually ceased demanding that Rus princes perform pagan ritual as a condition of submission. Whether that is precisely what the historical record shows, or whether it belongs to the tradition that grew around the martyrdom, the shape of the claim is telling. 2 men refused something unreasonable, and the unreasonable demand, over time, stopped being made. Michael dies where the fires still burn, and the Horde, for all its vastness, for all the armies and roads and relay horses and subject princes it commands across a continent, has to stoop down to kill him. So was Michael's death meaningless? Consider what it did not do. It did not break the Golden Horde. It did not stop the tribute. It did not liberate Chernigov or rebuild Kiev or restore a single prince who had already bent the knee and gone home with his title intact. If the only measure of a historical act is its immediate political consequence, then Michael of Chernigov died for nothing, in a tent beside the Volga, watched by a man eating dinner. But history does not only remember victories, it remembers lines. Michael's death became a story people retold across generations, not because it changed the political map, but because it answered a question that everyone living under the Horde had to carry quietly. Is there a point at which submission becomes something else entirely? Is there a cost beyond which compliance stops being survival and becomes betrayal? His refusal planted the answer in the tradition, in the chronicle, in the icon, in the church calendar, in the retelling. That one man had stood at that exact point, recognized it for what it was, and chosen accordingly. That is the answer to the mystery box. He did not go to Sarai expecting to topple an empire. He went hoping there was still a difference between humiliation and betrayal. When he discovered there wasn't, he chose the one thing the system could not price. He could give them his taxes, he could give them his body, he could give them his crown. He would not give them worship. History filed that under martyrdom. But stripped of the theological category, it is something older and more fundamental. The record of a man who found the line he could not cross and did not cross it, and paid what it cost without flinching. The Horde priced everything. It could not price that. If you stayed to the end, you care what history actually did to the people trapped inside it. That makes you one of the remnants. Subscribe, because the next episode moves east and forward to the Tver Revolt, where the pressure of tribute, the presence of a Mongol overseer, and decades of accumulated humiliation finally break open into something the Horde did not see coming. Open rebellion in the streets of a Russian city. Same empire, different fire.